My name is Seraphina, and at the age of 21, I was branded a traitor and sent to the edge of the world to die. I was a lady of the court, a scholar, and the king's trusted niece, but in the gilded halls of Ethelgard, trust is a currency more volatile than gold, and family is often just a prettier word for enemy. What my betrayers didn't count on was that my prison would become my fortress, and my jailer, a man as broken and discarded as I was, would become my greatest ally. This is the story of how a disgraced knight and an exiled lady, bound together by chains of misfortune, reclaimed their honor and took back a kingdom. Before I dive into how it all went so terribly wrong, and then so unexpectedly right, I'd love it if you'd let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you've ever felt the sting of betrayal from someone you were supposed to be able to trust, go ahead and hit that like button. For all the new faces here, make sure you subscribe to join a community of people who understand that sometimes your greatest strength is forged in the fires you were never meant to survive. The world I knew before Greywatch Spire was one of silk and whispers. The court of King Theron, my uncle, was a sprawling ecosystem of ambition where alliances shifted like sand dunes and a misplaced word could undo a dynasty. I had learned to navigate it not with a sword, but with a mind sharpened by endless hours in the royal library. I was the king's quiet advisor, the one he turned to for historical precedent, for treaty analysis, for the subtle art of statecraft that others, like my cousin Valerius, found so tedious. Valerius preferred the sharp, brutal clarity of a dagger to the nuanced dance of diplomacy. He was handsome, charismatic, and wore his ambition like a gleaming breastplate. We had grown up together, two sides of the same noble coin. I loved him as a brother, blind to the corrosion of jealousy that was eating away at his soul. I saw his competitive nature as a sibling rivalry. I didn't see it as the predatory hunger it truly was. He wanted the king's ear, the king's power, and I unwittingly stood in his way. I remember the week before my fall, with a clarity that still chills me. I had advised my uncle against a trade pact with the northern clans, citing their history of broken promises. I presented my research, old maps, forgotten treaties, first-hand accounts from past emissaries. The king listened, and heeded my counsel. Valerius had been the pact's most vocal champion. In the council chamber, he had smiled graciously in defeat, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, a brief, cold fire that I dismissed as disappointment. It was not disappointment, it was a promise. The end came swiftly, with the brutal efficiency of a guillotine. I was awakened not by my handmaiden, but by the heavy thud of gauntleted fists on my chamber door. Sir Garrick, the captain of the royal guard, stood in the doorway, his face a mask of grim duty. Behind him, guardsmen filled the hall, their armor glinting ominously in the pre-dawn light. They said nothing as they ransacked my rooms. They tore books from shelves, upended my writing desk, and ripped tapestries from the walls. I stood frozen in my nightdress, the cold of the stone floor seeping into my bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was Valerius who found it. Of course it was him. He pulled a small, locked rosewood box from a hidden compartment behind my wardrobe, a compartment I didn't even know existed. He presented it to Sir Garrick with a somber flourish. Inside, nestled on velvet lining, were letters. Letters written in a script that was a near-perfect imitation of my own, bearing a forged copy of my personal seal. They detailed a plot, intricate and treasonous, to poison the king and place a foreign duke, a rival of the northern clans, on the throne. They were filled with coded language and intimate details of the king's habits, details only someone in my position would know. My trial was a farce, a piece of theater designed to legitimize a foregone conclusion. I stood before the royal court, the very people I had dined with, debated with, and advised, and saw only strangers. Valerius stood beside the king, his face a perfect portrait of sorrow and reluctant duty. He spoke of his heartbreak at discovering his own cousin's treachery. He wept, and the court wept with him. My pleas were dismissed as the desperate lies of a cornered traitor. My demand to question the provenance of the letters was denied. The evidence was absolute, they said. The forger had done their work well, capturing the cadence of my prose, the unique curl of my sup. It was a masterpiece of deceit. When I looked at my uncle, the king, I saw not a ruler weighing justice, but a man terrified, betrayed, and easily led by the nearest, loudest voice. And that voice belonged to Valerius. "For your heinous treason against the crown," the king declared, his voice trembling but firm, "you are hereby stripped of your titles, your lands, and your name. You are sentenced to live out the remainder of your days in the prison of Greywatch Spire. May the gods have mercy on your blackened soul, for I have none." The sentence was a living death. Greywatch was a forgotten place on the northernmost coast, a crumbling ruin battered by the relentless fury of the shattered sea. No one returned from Greywatch. The journey north was a week-long descent into hell. I was thrown into a cage on the back of a cart, dressed in rough-spun wool that chafed my skin raw. The guards who escorted me were cruel, their conversation a litany of crude jokes at my expense. They saw me as a fallen creature, an object of scorn to be tormented for their amusement. They withheld water, tossed me scraps of stale bread as if feeding a dog, and reveled in the gasps and jeers of the villagers we passed through. Each mile stripped away another layer of the woman I had been. By the time the jagged silhouette of Greywatch Spire clawed its way into view against a bruised twilight sky, I was little more than a ghost, hollowed out by grief and humiliation. The spire was even more dreadful than the legends claimed. It was a single, monstrous tower of black rock, clinging to the edge of a cliff like a dying man's last breath. The sea crashed against its base, with a sound like the world breaking. The wind howled through its broken crenellations, a constant, mournful scream. This was not a prison, it was a tomb. At the gate, a man was waiting. He was tall and broad, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same unforgiving rock as the castle. His hair was the color of iron filings, his eyes a stormy gray. He wore scuffed leather and a tarnished steel gorget, the only remnant of the knight he once was. His posture was a study in resentment. This was Sir Callan, my jailer. He looked at me with an expression of pure, undiluted contempt. "So the traitor arrives," he said, his voice a low growl like grinding stone. He didn't offer a hand as the guards roughly pulled me from the cage. I stumbled and fell to my knees on the wet cobblestones. He just watched. "Get up," he commanded. "Your chambers await." He led me through the decaying fortress. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone, salt, and despair. Water dripped from the ceilings, and green moss crept over the walls. My chambers were a suite of rooms in the upper part of the spire. They might have once been grand, with a large, stone-framed window overlooking the sea, but now they were a ruin. The furniture was rotted, the tapestries were shredded rags, and the cold was a living thing that burrowed deep into your marrow. "These are your boarders," Callan said, his arm sweeping to indicate the suite. "You do not cross them. I will bring you food once a day. You will not speak to me unless spoken to. Attempt to escape, and I will throw you from the highest battlement myself. Do you understand?" I looked at him, my own anger a small flickering ember in the vast emptiness of my despair. "I am not a traitor," I whispered, my voice raw. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That's what they all say. Here you are, whatever I say you are. And I say you are a traitorous cur who got what she deserved. Now, get used to your new life." He slammed the heavy oak door, and the sound of the bolt sliding home was the sound of my world ending. The first weeks were a blur of misery. The isolation was a physical weight pressing down on me, silencing my thoughts. The daily routine was a torment. Callan would shove a wooden bowl of thin, tasteless gruel and a chunk of hard bread through a slot in the door. He never spoke, but I could feel his hatred radiating through the wood. He was my keeper, but also my tormentor, a constant, silent reminder of my fall. He was punishing me, not just for my supposed crime, but for his own. I learned later that being assigned as the warden of Greywatch was the ultimate punishment for a knight of the realm, a disgrace second only to execution. He was in a prison as much as I was. Our shared confinement did not breed camaraderie, it bred a toxic simmering animosity. Enjoying the royal treatment, he would sneer on the rare occasions he opened the door to inspect my cell. I trust the accommodations are to your ladyship's liking. Better the company of rats than a dishonored brute like you, I would retort, my words laced with a venom that surprised even myself. I saw in him everything I despised about the martial world, a man of violence and blind obedience, incapable of reason or nuance. He saw in me everything he hated about the nobility, a pampered, scheming creature who played with lives as if they were game pieces. We were perfect mirrors of each other's prejudices. There was one other soul in that desolate place, an old man named Silas, the groundskeeper. He was mute, his tongue supposedly cut out years ago for some forgotten offense. He tended a small wind-battered garden in the lee of the tower, coaxing pale vegetables from the thin, salty soil. He never looked at me directly, but sometimes I would find a small offering left outside my door after he had passed, a slightly larger potato in my bowl, a patch of dried moss to stuff into the cracks in the window frame. Once, even a single perfect seashell, its pearlescent interior, a stark contrast to the oppressive gray of my world. These small, silent kindnesses were the only things that kept me from succumbing entirely to the crushing despair. They were whispers of humanity in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. I tried to escape once, a foolish, desperate attempt. I had spent days loosening a bar on my window, my fingers raw and bleeding. I planned to use shredded blankets as a rope to climb down to the rocks below. Kalen caught me. He didn't shout. He was terrifyingly calm. He simply stood in the doorway, watching me struggle with the bar. When I finally noticed him, I froze. He walked over, tested the bar with one hand, and then, with a single contemptuous wrench, tore it completely from the stone. He threw it to the floor with a deafening clang. "The fall wouldn't kill you," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "The rocks would break your legs. The tide would do the rest. It would be slow. Is that what you want?" He stared at me, and for the first time, I saw something beyond his anger. I saw a profound weariness, a deep-seated exhaustion with death and suffering. He left without another word, but he didn't fix the window. It was a strange sort of message. He had shown me the futility of my efforts, but he had also left me with the howling wind, a constant reminder of the world outside, a world I was determined to one day reclaim. The storm that changed everything arrived without warning, a monstrous behemoth of wind and water that hurled itself at the coast. It was a storm of legend, the kind sailors tell tales of to frighten children. For 2 days the spire shuddered under its assault. The sea rose, its waves crashing halfway up the tower, and the wind screamed like a banshee. I huddled in the driest corner of my room, wrapped in every scrap of cloth I possessed, listening to the castle groaning around me. On the second night, there was a sound unlike any other, a deep, grinding roar that seemed to come from the very foundations of the tower. The floor beneath me heaved, and with a deafening crack, a huge section of the outer wall of my chamber gave way. Stone and mortar exploded inwards. I remember a brief, blinding pain, then darkness. I awoke to the sensation of being crushed. My leg was pinned beneath a massive block of granite, the pain so intense it was a white-hot scream in my mind. Dust filled my lungs, and the rain, now unimpeded, lashed down on me. I was trapped, exposed to the full fury of the storm, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I was going to die. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, but then, through the haze of pain, I heard a voice shouting my name. It was Kalen. A moment later, his shape appeared in the gaping hole of the wall, silhouetted against the lightning-streaked sky. He saw my predicament, and without a moment's hesitation, he began to climb over the treacherous pile of rubble. The wind tore at him, and smaller stones rained down from above, but he moved with a desperate, focused energy. He reached me and knelt, his face grim. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice barely audible over the gale. For hours, he worked. He used a shattered timber as a lever, his muscles straining, the veins in his neck standing out like cords. He dug with his bare hands, ignoring the cuts and scrapes. He was not my jailer. He was a force of nature, a man battling a mountain to save a life. My life. When he finally shifted the great stone, the release of pressure was so agonizing that I screamed and blacked out. When I woke again, the storm had passed. I was in his quarters, a Spartan, clean room with a real bed and a crackling fire in the hearth. My leg was tightly bound in clean linen, the pain reduced to a dull, throbbing ache. Kalen was sitting in a chair by the fire, sharpening a knife, his face etched with exhaustion. He had saved me. The man who hated me had risked his own life to save mine. Why? I whispered, my voice hoarse. He didn't look up from his whetstone. My duty is to keep you alive in this prison, he said gruffly, not to let the prison itself kill you. But his answer felt hollow, a shield for something deeper. We both knew he had gone far beyond the bounds of duty. A wall between us had crumbled that night, one far more significant than the one made of stone. My recovery was slow, and the forced proximity changed our world. I was confined to his quarters, and he became my reluctant nurse. He brought me food, changed my bandages, and carried me to the chair by the fire each morning. The silence between us, once thick with hostility, was now filled with a tentative curiosity. We began to talk. Truly talk. It started with small things, the history of the castle, the habits of the seabirds. Then one evening, as the firelight danced on the stone walls, I asked him the question that had been burning in my mind. Why were you sent here, Kellen? A knight of your skill. You don't belong in a place like this. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, heavy with the weight of memory. I refused an order, he said. We were pursuing a band of rebels in the southern hills. We tracked them to a small village. My commander, Lord Fendrel, declared the entire village guilty of harboring them. He ordered us to lock the gates and burn it to the ground. Men, women, children, everyone. He paused, his jaw tightening. I refused. I drew my sword on him, told him there was no honor in butchering innocents. The revelation hung in the air between us. What happened? I asked softly. My men stood with me. We disobeyed. Fendrel reported me for insubordination and mutiny. He said I allowed the rebels to escape. The court-martial was swift. They stripped me of my command and sent me here to rot. He looked at me then, his stormy eyes filled with a raw pain. The noble Lord Fendrel was promoted. He sits on the king's council now. He was always a favorite of your cousin Valerius. The name hit me like a physical blow. Valerius. The threads were beginning to connect, forming a dark and intricate tapestry. His story resonated with my own, a swift, unjust punishment orchestrated by men loyal to my cousin. For the first time, I saw Kalen not as a brute, but as a man of principle, a man who had sacrificed everything for his honor, and he, in turn, began to see me as something other than a treacherous noblewoman. He saw my mind at work as I spoke of politics, of history, of law. He saw the injustice that had been done to me reflected in his own fate. A fragile truce was born, nurtured in the shared warmth of the fireplace. He started bringing books from the castle's neglected library, a vast, dusty treasure trove that had been my one solace before the storm. If you're going to be stuck here, he'd said, you might as well not let your mind rot. The library became our sanctuary, our war room. As my leg healed, I spent every waking hour there, Kalen often by my side. The place was a chaotic archive of the kingdom's history. I began to read not for pleasure, but for answers. I studied the legal precedents for treason, the history of royal seals, the lineage of the noble houses. I was looking for a crack, a flaw in the perfect trap Valerius had built. Kalen, with his military background, brought a different perspective. He looked at the plot described in the forged letters from a strategic standpoint. It makes no sense, he said, one evening poring over a copy of the accusations I had written from memory. The duke they claim you were plotting with is a known coward. His forces are poorly equipped. To overthrow the king, you would have needed the armies of the Western lords, not him. This is an amateur's plan. Or, I countered, a sudden, thrilling idea taking root. It's a plan designed by someone who knows nothing of military strategy, but everything about court politics. Someone who didn't need the plot to succeed, only to look plausible enough to condemn me. Our work became an obsession. We were a team, his pragmatism balancing my scholarship. The long hours spent poring over dusty tomes by candlelight changed us. The space between us dwindled. We would lean over the same map, our shoulders brushing, and a current would pass between us that had nothing to do with our investigation. I learned the landscape of his face, the small scar above his eyebrow, the way his eyes softened when he was deep in thought. He learned my habits, the way I chewed on my lip when I was close to a breakthrough, the quiet hum that escaped me when I read something fascinating. We were two lonely souls finding a strange sort of home in one another. The breakthrough came from an old, leather-bound ledger, detailing the castle's expenses from 100 years prior. Tucked inside its pages was a faded map of the spire, far more detailed than any other I had seen. It showed a network of hidden passages, service tunnels, and most importantly, a secret exit, a sea cave at the base of the cliff, accessible only at low tide. Hope, a feeling I had long since abandoned, surged through me with dizzying force. We had a way out, but escape was not enough. We needed proof. The answer lay in the very tools of my condemnation. The letters, Kalen's knowledge of military ciphers, and my understanding of courtly correspondence proved to be a powerful combination. We dissected the forged letters word by word. Here, I said, pointing to a phrase. To my dearest compatriot, I would never use that phrasing. It's too theatrical. Valerius, on the other hand, adores that kind of melodrama. Kalen found another flaw. The seal. It's almost perfect, but look at the wax. It's from a supplier in the capital's merchant district. You, as a member of the royal household, get your wax from the royal scribe. The composition is different. The color is a fraction of a shade off. It was a tiny detail, one no one would have noticed, unless they were looking for it. We were looking. The final piece of the puzzle came not from a book, but from Silas. One day, as he delivered a basket of roots, he saw us studying the map. He paused, his cloudy eyes widening slightly. He pointed a trembling finger at a section of the library wall, then tapped it 3 times. Kalen and I exchanged a look. We went to the spot, a section of innocuous-looking stone shelves. Behind a row of crumbling histories, we found it a loose stone. Inside was a small, hidden cavity. Within lay a bundle of letters, wrapped in oilskin. They were written by the castle's previous warden and addressed to his brother. They were a bitter chronicle of his last years, filled with complaints about his isolation and the political machinations of the court. And in one of them, he mentioned a visit from a young, ambitious nobleman who had been intensely interested in the castle's defenses, its forgotten history, and its suitability as an inescapable prison. The nobleman's name was Valerius. He had been planning my exile long before he had the means to make it happen. We had it. The motive, the means, the proof of long-standing premeditation. We looked at each other in the dim, dusty light of the library, the letters clutched in my hand. The air was thick with the dust of ages, but for us it was electric with possibility. Kalen reached out and his hand covered mine. His touch was warm, solid, and real. "We are going to take him down, Seraphina," he said, and his voice was not the growl of a jailer, but the vow of a knight. In that moment, surrounded by forgotten words and lost histories, we were no longer prisoner and guard. We were allies, and in the quiet space between one breath and the next, I realized I was feeling something more than respect, more than gratitude. In the heart of my stone prison, I had found the one thing I'd never had in the glittering court, a true partner. The plan we forged was as perilous as the sea that battered our prison walls. Escape was only the first, most dangerous step. We couldn't simply appear at the capital with our story. Valerius now had a year to solidify his power, to place his cronies in key positions. He controlled the narrative. To be heard, we needed to create a moment so public, so dramatic, that he would have no chance to silence us. We needed an ally, someone whose honor was unimpeachable and who commanded enough respect to make the king listen. Kalen had one such person in mind, General Cassian, his former mentor, and one of the few truly honorable men left at court. Our goal was to escape Greywatch, travel to Athelgard in secret, and present our evidence to the general before confronting Valerius at the grandest social event of the season, the King's Jubilee Feast. Silas became our silent, indispensable conspirator. He helped us gather supplies, dried fish, hardtack, and water skins, hiding them in the passages. He studied the tide charts with us, his gnarled finger tracing the cycles of the moon. His loyalty was a quiet, unwavering anchor in our sea of uncertainty. The night of our escape was moonless, the sky a blanket of impenetrable black velvet. The tide was at its lowest ebb, a rare alignment that gave us a precious 2-hour window. Kalen went first, a rope tied around his waist, the torchlight casting his shadow long and monstrous against the tunnel walls. The air in the passages was stale, tasting of stone and secrets. We moved through a labyrinth of history, our footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The tunnels grew narrower and more treacherous. At one point we came to a section that had partially collapsed. A massive chokestone blocked our path. "I can't shift it," Kalen grunted, his shoulders straining against the rock. My heart hammered against my ribs. This couldn't be the end. My eyes scanned the tunnel, and I saw it, a series of cracks in the ceiling just above the stone. It was a keystone. "Don't push it, Kalen," I said, my voice tight with urgency. "We need to break the support above it. Give me your dagger." He looked at me, skepticism warring with trust in his eyes, but he handed it over. I used the hilt to hammer at the crumbling mortar around the keystone. Dust rained down on us. With a final, sharp crack, the keystone gave way. The chokestone below it groaned and settled a few inches, creating a gap just wide enough for us to squeeze through. He looked at me, his face smudged with dirt, a slow smile spreading across his lips. "Brains and brawn," he murmured. "A formidable combination." The final stretch of the tunnel was a steep, slippery descent that opened into the sea cave. The sound of the waves was deafening, a hungry roar that filled the cavern. The air was cold and sharp with the sting of salt. Freedom was just a few feet away. As we prepared to wade into the churning water toward the sliver of beach visible beyond the cave mouth, we heard it, the rhythmic splash of oars. Kalen grabbed me, pulling me back into the shadows. A small patrol boat, its lantern swinging, was making its way along the base of the cliff. A spot check. Valerius was more paranoid than we'd thought. We held our breath, flattened against the wet rock. The lantern light swept across the mouth of the cave, a brilliant, terrifying beam that missed us by inches. The voices of the guards carried on the wind, complaining about the cold and their pointless duty. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the boat moved on, its light shrinking into the darkness. We didn't wait. We plunged into the icy water, the shock of it stealing my breath. We fought our way through the surf, the waves trying to drag us back until our feet finally found purchase on the shingle beach. We collapsed onto the shore, gasping, soaked and shivering, but we were out. We were free. Looking back at the dark tower of Greywatch Spire, a silhouette against the stars, I felt not hatred, but a strange sense of gratitude. It was the place where I had lost everything, but it was also the place where I had found myself, and where I had found him. The journey south was a hard, furtive trek through a land that was once mine. We traveled by night, sleeping in barns and abandoned crofts, living off the food Silas had given us. We were no longer a lady and a knight. We were fugitives, with the hunted look of wolves. The kingdom felt different. There was a tension in the air, a watchfulness in the towns that hadn't been there before. Valerius's influence was a creeping poison. We saw more guards on the roads, their banners bearing his personal crest alongside the king's. His power was growing. Reaching Ethelgard, we were two ghosts slipping back into a life that no longer wanted us. We used the last of our meager funds to buy drab cloaks, our faces hidden in their cowls. The city was festooned with banners for the Jubilee, a garish display of forced celebration that felt obscene to me. We found shelter in the city's underbelly, in a grimy inn where no one asked questions. Kalon managed to get a message to General Cassian through a trusted former subordinate, a coded request for a meeting at a neutral secret location, an old, disused chapel. The general arrived alone, his stern face carved with worry. He listened to our story in silence, his eyes fixed on Kalon, then on me. He examined our evidence, the analysis of the forged letters, the warden's correspondence, my own testimony. When we were finished, he rose, his back ramrod straight. "I always suspected Fendrel was a snake," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and Valerius his master. I believed you failed your duty, Kalon. For that I am sorry. As for you, my lady, the king was blinded by grief and fear. It is time for him to see." The night of the Jubilee feast, the great hall of the palace was a blaze of light and color. Hundreds of nobles, dressed in their finest silks and jewels, feasted and drank, their laughter echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. Valerius stood beside the king's throne, a confident, smiling puppet master, basking in the glow of his success. Kalon and I entered not through the main doors, but through a service entrance, guided by one of the general's men. We were no longer dressed as fugitives. Kalon wore a suit of polished, unadorned steel, the armor of a knight, simple and severe. I wore a plain, dark blue gown, the color of the midnight sea. We were not there as supplicants. We were there as judges. We waited for the moment the king would rise to make his toast. As he lifted his goblet, the great hall doors swung open. General Cassian entered, flanked by a dozen of his most loyal household guards. The hall fell silent. Then, from the shadows behind them, Kalon and I stepped into the light. A collective gasp swept through the room. Faces turned pale. My uncle, the king, stared at me as if he had seen a specter, his goblet slipping from his trembling hand to crash on the floor. Valerius's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure shock which quickly curdled into rage. "Seize them," he shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at us. "They are traitors! Seize them!" But the royal guard hesitated, looking from Valerius to the stone-faced General Cassian and his men, who had formed a protective ring around us. "They are no traitors," the general's voice boomed, cutting through the tension. "They are victims of treason, and they have come for justice." I walked forward, my step steady, my gaze locked on my cousin. "Hello, Valerius," I said, my voice clear and carrying in the sudden stillness. "Did you miss me?" I presented our evidence, my voice never wavering. I laid out his conspiracy, step by damning step. I spoke of the forged letters, of the carefully chosen Patsy Duke, of the wax seal. Then Kalon stepped forward, and his voice was like thunder as he recounted Lord Fendrel's order to burn the village, linking Valerius's corruption directly to the king's own military command. Valerius began to bluster, to deny, to accuse me of being a mad woman, a witch who had ensorcelled a disgraced knight. "She lies," he screamed at the king. "This is a plot against me, against the crown." But the seeds of doubt had been sown. The nobles were whispering, their eyes darting between us. The king looked at Valerius, and for the first time, a flicker of suspicion broke through his fear. The final blow came not from us, but from Lord Fendrel himself. Panicked at being implicated, he tried to slip away. General Cassian's men intercepted him at the door. Dragged before the king, his arrogance shattered, Fendrel confessed everything, hoping for leniency, implicating Valerius as the mastermind behind it all. The truth once unleashed was a tidal wave. Valerius lunged for a guard's sword, a last, desperate act of a cornered animal. But Kalon was faster. He moved with a blur of speed, disarming him with a single precise movement. My cousin, the architect of my ruin, stood defeated, his weapon clattering on the marble floor, the sound echoing the fall of all his ambitions. In the stunned silence of the great hall, Valerius was taken away by the general's guards, his face a contorted mask of hatred. The feast was over. Justice, it turned out, was a bitter dish best served cold. The next day, I was summoned to the king's private study. He looked 10 years older, the weight of his folly pressing down on him. He offered me a full pardon, the restoration of my titles, my lands, anything I wanted. He apologized, his words stumbling, inadequate. I did not feel triumph. I felt a profound, weary sadness. Your apology is for your own conscience, uncle, not for mine, I said, my voice quiet but firm. You did not seek the truth. You sought an easy answer, and Valerius gave you one. A king who cannot distinguish loyalty from flattery is a king who rules a kingdom of lies. I don't want my titles back. I want you to rule justly. I want you to create a council of review, so that no one can ever be condemned on the word of one man again. He was taken aback by my refusal, by my demand. He had expected tears or gratitude, not a political ultimatum. He agreed. My name was cleared, but the stain on the crown remained. Kalen was brought before the king next. He was reinstated, his honor restored. He was offered command of the royal guard, the very position he had dreamed of his entire life. It was everything he had ever wanted. That evening, I found him on the battlements of the palace, looking out over the city. The celebratory lights seemed distant, foreign. "Will you accept the command?" I asked. He stared into the darkness for a long time. "The man who wanted that command died in a disgraced night cell in Greywatch," he said softly. "He learned that honor isn't a title or a uniform. It's a choice you make when no one is watching." He turned to me, his gray eyes searching my face. "And you, my lady, will you return to the council? You could be the most powerful woman in the kingdom." I thought of the whispering corridors, the false smiles, the endless, exhausting games. "That woman," I said, echoing his sentiment, "was buried under the rubble of a prison wall. She learned that power isn't about having the king's ear. It's about knowing your own mind." We stood in the comfortable silence of perfect understanding. The chaos of the court swirled below us, but up on that battlement, there was only a profound sense of peace. He reached out and took my hand, his calloused fingers intertwined with mine. "We have no place here anymore, do we?" he asked. "No," I said, my heart swelling with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I think our place is somewhere else." He drew me closer, and in the cool night air, under a sky full of indifferent stars, he kissed me. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or triumphant celebration. It was a kiss of quiet homecoming, a promise of a new beginning, forged in the ruins of our old lives. I did visit Valerius once, in the dungeons beneath the palace. He was in a cold, damp cell, a mirror of the one I had occupied. He was no longer the charismatic courtier. He was a hollowed-out thing, consumed by his own bitterness. He spat curses at me, blamed me for his downfall. There was no remorse, only rage at being caught. I listened silently. When he was done, I simply said, "You sent me to a desolate rock to be forgotten. But you forgot that pressure and time can turn stone into a diamond, Valerius. I am stronger than you ever imagined. Enjoy your own prison." I left him there, in the darkness he had created, and I never looked back. We left Athelgard a week later, with no fanfare. We turned our backs on the power, the politics, and the pain, and we headed north, back toward the sea. 1 year later, the view from my window was the same, yet entirely different. I still looked out at the shattered sea from the tower of Greywatch Spire, but the glass was no longer cracked and grimy. It was clean and clear. The wind still howled, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like music. We had used the wealth restored to me to rebuild the castle, not as a prison, but as a sanctuary. The crumbling walls were repaired, the leaking roofs mended. The great library was now the heart of the spire, its shelves filled with new books alongside the old, its reading rooms warmed by roaring fires. Greywatch became a place of learning and refuge, a haven for scholars, thinkers, and those who, like us, had been wronged by an unjust world. A young historian, accused of heresy for his radical ideas, was our first resident. We had welcomed him, given him a room, and offered him the full use of our library. Watching him work, his face alight with the passion of discovery, I knew we had made the right choice. Kalen stood beside me, his arm around my waist. He had not taken a title. He was simply Kalen of Greywatch, my partner, my equal. He managed the fortress's restoration, trained a small, dedicated guard, sworn to protect our haven, and spent his evenings with me by the fire, reading. The peace he had found here was more profound than any glory he could have won in the capital. Silas was the master of the gardens, which now bloomed with impossible color, a testament to his silent, patient care. He smiled often, a genuine, deep-set joy that transformed his weathered face. "Do you ever miss it?" Kalen asked, his voice a low murmur against my hair, his gaze on the wild sea. I thought of the silk gowns, the endless banquets, the weight of the king's favor. They felt like memories from someone else's life, a story I had once read in a book. "I miss nothing," I said, and it was the truest thing I had ever spoken. Everything I could ever want is right here. My exile was meant to be the end of my story, a final, tragic chapter. But it was only the beginning. Valerius had meant to bury me, but he didn't know that I was a seed. In the harshest, most unforgiving soil, I had not only survived, I had grown. My prison had become my home, my jailer had become my love, my disgrace had become my greatest strength. So in the end, my cousin's ambition gave me the one thing he could never have, a life of genuine meaning, built not on power over others, but on service to them. I learned that honor is not about titles, and strength is not about vengeance. It's about what you build from the rubble. Now I want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments below. Have you ever found strength in a moment of utter despair, or found an unexpected ally in the darkest of times? Don't forget to like this video if our story of love and justice resonated with you, and please subscribe for more tales of resilience and reclaimed destinies. Thank you so much for listening to my journey today. I hope it serves as a reminder for anyone facing their own Greywatch Spire. Sometimes the walls meant to imprison you can become the very foundations of your fortress.